They say that silence is golden. But sometimes, silence isn't agreement. It is calculation. It is the deep, indrawn breath before the storm, the quiet hardening of a heart that is drawing a final, indelible line in the sand. For Arthur Pendleton, a 78-year-old widower living in the quiet, leafy suburbs of Connecticut, silence had become his sanctuary, but on this crisp autumn morning, it became his weapon. The day began like any other. The air was cool, smelling of damp earth and decaying leaves. Arthur had his coffee, he read the paper, and then he made his way to the garage, a ritual as ingrained as breathing. He planned to spend the morning polishing the chrome on his 1968 Ford Mustang, a moss-green vessel of memories that was more precious to him than the house it was parked in. But when he opened the door, the space was hollow, empty, disturbingly vast. The only evidence that the car had ever been there was a dark, familiar oil stain on the concrete floor, a ghost of what was lost. He stood there for a long moment, his heart a cold, heavy stone in his chest. His son, Ethan, and his daughter-in-law, Sarah, found him there, their expressions a placid mixture of concern and impatience. It was Ethan who spoke first, his voice casual, as if commenting on the weather. "Oh, that. Yeah, we finally cleared out the garage. It was time," Sarah chimed in, her voice unnaturally bright. "It was a safety hazard, Dad. Leaking oil, taking up so much space. We called a guy, he towed it away to the scrapyard. We even got a few $100s for it." Arthur didn't shout, he didn't rage or demand answers. He simply turned his pale blue eyes on them, eyes that had designed buildings that touched the sky, eyes that had watched his wife, Eleanor, take her last breath. He looked at them, and he remained silent. They saw an old man, perhaps confused, perhaps finally accepting his own decline. They did not see the tectonic shift happening behind his gaze. They did not feel the profound grief for Eleanor, which had been a soft, warm ache for years, suddenly crystallizing into something cold, sharp, and purposeful. In their casual greed and breathtaking disrespect, they had done more than sell a car. They had taken the last tangible piece of his life with the woman he loved, and they had sold it for scrap. Arthur nodded slowly, a small, almost imperceptible movement. "I see," he said, his voice quiet, steady. He turned and walked back into the house, leaving them in the echoing emptiness of the garage. They thought they had won. They thought they had removed another obstacle. But they had miscalculated. They mistook his silence for weakness, his stillness for surrender. They had no idea that in that moment, the quiet, grieving architect had died, and in his place, a meticulous planner of a very different kind of structure had just been born. One built not of steel and glass, but of consequence and retribution. To understand the depth of the betrayal, you must first understand the man who was betrayed. Arthur Pendleton was not born a quiet man. He was a man forged in an era of sharp lines and solid foundations, both in character and in his chosen profession. As an architect, his mind was a cathedral of mathematics and artistry, a place where he could conjure skyscrapers from ink and paper. His hands, though now spotted with age, had been instruments of creation, steady and sure. He had built a legacy across the skyline of New York City, structures of steel and glass that were monuments to his precision and vision. He was a man who believed in things that lasted: honor, a firm handshake, a promise kept, and a love that could withstand the erosion of time. His marriage to Eleanor was the cornerstone of his life. She was not just his wife, she was his partner in every sense of the word. Where he saw structure, she saw life. She was the one who chose the art for their walls, who planted the unruly garden that defied the neat lines of their home, who filled his quiet, ordered world with laughter and unpredictable warmth. They were two halves of a perfect design, and for 52 years, their life together was a masterwork of quiet devotion. The 1968 Ford Mustang was a testament to that love. It was not a midlife crisis purchase or a collector's item to be sealed away. It was their beginning. They bought it on a sun-drenched afternoon in California during their honeymoon, the foolish, wonderful, extravagant purchase of two young people who were rich in nothing but their love for each other. The car smelled of new leather and limitless possibility. It was the chariot that carried them up the Pacific Coast Highway, the ocean wind whipping through Eleanor's hair, her laughter competing with the roar of the V8 engine. That car was woven into the very fabric of their family. There was a small, crescent-shaped dent on the rear fender, just below the taillight. To anyone else, it was a flaw. To Arthur, it was a sacred mark. It happened the day they brought their son, Ethan, home from the hospital. In the joyful, nervous chaos of handling a newborn, Arthur had backed clumsily out of the hospital parking spot, tapping a metal post. Eleanor had laughed, not with anger, but with pure, unadulterated joy, saying the car was now officially a family car, complete with its first scar. The car held the ghost of every summer vacation, every trip to the drive-in movie theater, every drive to college, with a car packed so full of Ethan's belongings they could barely see out the back window. The leather on the passenger seat was cracked in a unique pattern from the countless times Eleanor had shifted to look at him as he drove. The steering wheel was worn smooth, not by his hands, but by hers. From the years she took the driver's seat on their long, winding drives through the New England countryside each autumn. His weekly ritual of caring for the car was a silent conversation with his departed wife. He would wash it by hand with a soft sheepskin mitt, his movements slow and deliberate. As he polished the chrome until it shone like a mirror, he would tell her about his week, about the book he was reading, about the antics of the squirrels in the yard. He wasn't a man descending into senility. He was a man keeping a memory alive, tending to the last physical piece of their shared history with the reverence of a high priest. This shrine of devotion, however, was an object of contempt for the two people who now shared his home. Ethan and his wife Sarah were products of a different age, an age of disposability and instant gratification. They saw the world not through a lens of history and sentiment, but through the cold, unforgiving filter of a smartphone camera. Their lives were a curated collection of appearances, the right clothes, the right restaurants, the right social media posts. They lived in Arthur's spacious home, a home he had designed and built for Eleanor, but they moved through it like impatient landlords, not grateful children. They saw the house not as a home, but as an asset. They saw Arthur not as a father, but as a gatekeeper to their inheritance. Their disrespect was a slow-acting poison, administered in small, daily doses. They spoke of Arthur's past with a kind of weary indulgence, as if his stories were charming but ultimately irrelevant relics. When he would begin a sentence with, "Eleanor and I once," Ethan would subtly check his phone, or Sarah would interrupt with a question about dinner plans. They began managing his finances after he had a small health scare, a task they undertook with condescending sighs and pronouncements that his old-fashioned methods were just too complicated. In reality, it gave them access, a way to siphon funds for their own expensive tastes, justifying the purchases as household expenses or necessities for his care. They treated him like a problem to be managed. Sarah began updating the house, replacing Eleanor's carefully chosen furniture with sterile, modern pieces that looked like they belonged in a magazine, erasing his wife's presence one room at a time. Ethan would talk endlessly about the burden of property taxes, the cost of upkeep, the sheer inefficiency of one old man living in such a large space. The suggestions started subtly. "You know, Dad, we saw the most beautiful retirement community the other day. It's more like a resort." They painted a picture of a simplified life for him, a life free of burdens, which was, in truth, a life where they would be free of him. The Mustang in the garage was a particular source of irritation for them. They saw it as a useless relic, a hunk of junk that leaked oil and took up the space where a new, least luxury SUV could be parked. They didn't see the honeymoon, the newborn son, or the ghost of their mother's hand on the steering wheel. They saw only an obstacle, a stubborn piece of the past that refused to get out of the way of their future. And so, in their minds, it had to go. They simply couldn't comprehend that for Arthur, the car wasn't just metal, leather, and glass. It was the repository of a love that built his world, and they had just sold it for the price of scrap iron. The sale of the Mustang was not a sudden act of thoughtlessness. It was the final move in a quiet, calculated war, a campaign that had been waged against Arthur within the walls of his own home for months. It began subtly, a series of small, almost imperceptible erosions designed to weaken his confidence and make him question the integrity of his own mind. It was a strategy of psychological warfare, executed with the placid smiles and feigned concern that only family can truly master. The first front in their attack was his memory. Mail began to go missing. A birthday card from his sister, a letter from an old army friend, the quarterly statement from a small investment account, they would simply vanish. When Arthur would mention waiting for a piece of mail, Ethan would offer a dismissive shrug. "The postal service is a mess, Dad. You know how it is. It'll probably show up eventually." It never did. Then came the bills. Sarah had taken over paying them online, insisting it was more efficient. Suddenly, late notices began to appear. A $5 penalty on the electricity bill, a warning from the cable company. Each time, Sarah would present the notice to him with a performance of gentle frustration. "Oh, Arthur, I think you forgot to give me this one. I found it under a stack of magazines. It's okay, I've taken care of it, but we need to be more organized." The "we" was a masterpiece of passive aggression, a verbal sleight of hand that placed the blame squarely on him. They became the relentless curators of his reality. Conversations were invented, promises were imagined. "Dad, don't you remember?" Sarah would say, her brow furrowed with practiced sympathy. "We talked about this yesterday. I told you the landscapers were coming today." Arthur would search his mind, finding no trace of such a conversation, and the seed of doubt would be planted. Did he forget? Was his mind, once so sharp and clear, finally beginning to cloud over? He started keeping a small leather-bound notebook in his pocket, secretly jotting down important details, conversations, and dates. It was a silent act of rebellion, a way to anchor himself to the truth as they tried to set him adrift in a sea of confusion. With his confidence under siege, they opened the second front, an assault on the foundation of his life, the very house he had built for Eleanor. The campaign began at the dinner table, a place that had once been for family and laughter, now transformed into a boardroom for their ambitions. Ethan, ever the strategist, led with logic or what passed for it. He spread out papers, showing property tax assessments and projected maintenance costs. "Dad, you have to look at this from an asset management perspective," he'd say, using the kind of corporate jargon that was meaningless in the context of a home filled with 50 years of memories. "The market is at an all-time high. If we sell now, we can unlock a significant amount of equity. We can invest it in something with a much better return. It's the financially prudent thing to do." Sarah would follow with the emotional flanking maneuver. "Think of it, Arthur," she'd coo, placing her hand over his. "No more worrying about the roof or the plumbing, no more stairs. We could find you a gorgeous, modern condominium. Everything new, everything managed for you. It would be so much safer, so much easier." The words "managed" and "safer" were not meant for his comfort, but for their control. They envisioned him in a sterile white box of an apartment, a place with no history, no memories, and no space for a vintage Mustang. It was here that they misjudged him. They expected the confused, forgetful old man they were trying to create to simply acquiesce. Instead, they were met with the architect, the man who understood that a structure's strength comes from its foundation. Arthur placed his fork down, the quiet click echoing in the tense silence. He looked not at the papers, but at his son's face. "This house is not an asset," he said, his voice low but unwavering. "It is a ledger of our lives. The notch on the doorframe in the kitchen is where we measured your height every year until you were taller than your mother. The faint water stain on the ceiling in the living room is from the night we left the window open during a thunderstorm because we loved the sound of the rain. The rose bush by the porch is from a cutting your mother took from her childhood home." He paused, his gaze sweeping over both of them. "You are not asking me to sell a house. You are asking me to liquidate my marriage, to put a price on my memories." The answer is no. The conversation is over. The finality in his voice was absolute, and it infuriated them. Their frustration was not that of children whose father had refused them something, but of business partners whose deal had just fallen through. Having failed to dislodge him from his home, they moved to the final phase of their campaign: isolation. They began to build invisible walls around him, cutting him off from the outside world. His friends, men he had known for decades, found it increasingly difficult to reach him. The phone would ring, and before Arthur could get to it, Sarah would answer, her voice a caricature of sweetness. "Oh, hi, David. He's just settling down for a nap. The doctor says he really needs his rest these days. Can I have him call you back later?" He would never call back. The message was clear. Arthur was frail. Arthur was unwell. Arthur was not to be disturbed. His old friend Frank, who used to come by every Tuesday for a game of chess, was met at the door by Ethan. "Frank, good to see you, but today's not a great day. Dad's having one of his off days. A bit confused. Let's reschedule for next week. I'll call you." The call never came. Arthur's world, once a sprawling landscape of friendships and connections, began to shrink until it was confined to the house and the garden. His only regular companions were the two people who were actively working to dismantle his life. They surrounded him, their constant presence, a form of house arrest. They had chipped away at his confidence, failed to seize his home, and so they settled on imprisoning him within it. By cutting him off from anyone who knew the real Arthur Pendleton, they could reinforce the fiction of the feeble, incompetent old man they needed him to be. It was the last crucial step. If no one from the outside could see him or speak to him, then no one could object when they finally decided to dispose of the last, most stubborn symbol of his past, the old, moss-green Mustang in the garage. The sound of the garage door closing was a final, metallic thud, punctuating the end of an era. As Arthur walked back into the silent house, the mask of frailty descended upon his features, a carefully constructed facade of defeat. He moved slowly, his shoulders slumped, each step a seemingly painful effort. He settled into his old leather armchair, one of the few pieces Sarah hadn't yet replaced, and stared out the window, his eyes vacant. Ethan and Sarah followed him in, their victory lap disguised as concern. Sarah placed a cup of tea on the table beside him, her voice dripping with condescension. "Here you are, Arthur. This will make you feel better." He didn't respond, merely gave a slow, tired blink. Ethan, unable to contain his own vision for the future, began pacing the living room. "You know, with all that space in the garage now, we could put in a proper home gym, or maybe a workshop for my projects. It's a blank slate." Arthur just nodded faintly, a ghost in his own home. From the corner of his eye, he saw them exchange a look, a triumphant, self-satisfied glance that said, "It's done. He's broken. We've won." Later, he heard them whispering in the kitchen, their voices sharp with excitement, confident that his hearing was as faded as his spirit. "It was for the best," Sarah said. "He'll forget about that old car in a week." They had no idea. Arthur wasn't forgetting. He was remembering. As he sat there, a statue of grief, his mind was miles away, in a place of steel, secrets, and promises. He was thinking about the true nature of what they had thrown away. They thought they had sold a car. What they had actually done was discard the key to a hidden kingdom, a legacy built in secret by him and Eleanor. A final act of defiance against a world they had never fully trusted. The plan had been born 30 years ago, during a market downturn that had shaken their faith in conventional assets. Arthur and Eleanor, children of parents who spoke of the Great Depression in hushed, fearful tones, wanted something tangible. Something that couldn't be wiped out by a stock market crash or a banking failure. Something that belonged only to them. So, over the course of 2 decades, Arthur had quietly converted a portion of his earnings into untraceable, old-world wealth, bearer bonds. They were relics of a bygone era, anonymous certificates that belonged to whoever held them. He purchased them through discreet brokers, accumulating a fortune that existed completely off the grid. It was their runaway fund, their ticket to a life of absolute freedom in their final years. They had amassed nearly $2 million, a secret known only to the two of them, a treasure hidden in plain sight. And the treasure was not just the bonds. Tucked alongside them in the custom-built compartment was the deed to a small, rustic cabin on a secluded lake in Maine. It was a property Arthur had bought under a shell corporation decades ago. It had no mortgage, no digital footprint. It was their true home, the place they went when the world became too loud. It was where Eleanor painted watercolors and where Arthur designed buildings for his own pleasure, not for any client. It was a sanctuary, and the deed in that car was the only official record of their ownership. It was a life Ethan and Sarah knew nothing about, a life they could never have been a part of because it was built on values they could not comprehend: privacy, simplicity, and the richness of a shared silence. But the most precious item in that hidden trove was the last one. It was a thick, cream-colored envelope, sealed with wax, bearing Eleanor's elegant handwriting. It was her final letter to him, written in the last months of her life. She had made him promise not to open it until he truly needed to hear her voice one last time. He considered it her final set of instructions, her last piece of wisdom to guide him when she was gone. That letter was more valuable to him than all the bonds and property combined. It was the last, unopened chapter of their love story. The compartment itself was a work of architectural genius. It was not some crude box bolted to the undercarriage. Arthur had spent a month designing and fabricating it himself. It was a seamless, welded extension of the car's subframe, coated in the same underseal, indistinguishable from the original structure. The opening mechanism was his own design, a sequence known only to him and Eleanor. To open it, you had to turn the ignition key to the accessory position, pull the headlight knob out twice, and then press the brake pedal 3 times in quick succession. A quiet click would release a hidden latch. It was brilliant, foolproof, and now it was in the hands of a stranger. As night fell and the house settled into a deep silence, the performance ended. The frail old man was gone. Arthur rose from his chair, his movements now fluid and precise. Ethan and Sarah were asleep upstairs, dreaming their shallow dreams of new cars and expensive vacations, utterly oblivious to the quiet revolution happening below. He moved through the darkness of his own home like a stranger, his footsteps making no sound. He went to his study, to a bookshelf lined with heavy architectural tomes. He pulled out a thick volume titled Foundations of Structural Integrity. It was hollowed out inside. From it, he removed a small, shrink-wrapped package. Inside was a prepaid, untraceable cell phone, a burner phone, and a thick envelope containing $10,000 in cash. It was Eleanor's idea. For a real emergency, she had called it. When you can't trust anyone else. That time had come. He sat in the dark, the faint glow of the streetlights filtering through the blinds, and powered on the phone. He scrolled through the single contact he had pre-programmed into it years ago. David Chen, his former lawyer and oldest friend, a man whose integrity was as solid as the foundations Arthur used to design. He pressed the call button. The phone rang twice before a sleepy voice answered. Chen speaking. David, Arthur said, his voice a low, steady whisper. It's Arthur Pendleton. There was a pause on the other end, then the sound of rustling, as if David were sitting up in bed. Arthur? It's past midnight. Is everything all right? No, Arthur said, and for the first time that day, a sliver of cold, hard emotion entered his voice. Everything is not all right. They sold the car, David. Another pause, longer this time. David knew what the car meant. I need your help, Arthur continued, his voice dropping even lower, becoming pure, cold business. I need your discretion. It's about Eleanor's legacy. It's time to execute the contingency plan. The next morning, long before the sun had begun to bleach the dark sky, Arthur Pendleton moved with a purpose he had not felt in years. He dressed in simple, unremarkable clothes and slipped out of the house like a thief, leaving his sleeping jailers to their self-satisfied dreams. He walked 2 miles to a bus stop, a journey that made his old joints ache, but the cold, pre-dawn air sharpened his senses. He paid his fare in cash and rode the rattling, empty bus into the city, watching the world awaken through the grimy window. He was a ghost, deliberately erasing his own tracks. His destination was a small, all-night diner, the kind with cracked vinyl booths and the lingering smell of stale coffee and fried bacon. David Chen was already there, sitting in a corner booth, a folder on the table in front of him. David was a man whose calm exterior concealed a mind like a steel trap. He had been Arthur's lawyer for 30 years, but more than that, he had been his friend. As Arthur slid into the booth, David's expression was a mixture of deep concern and controlled anger. "You look tired, Arthur," David said, his voice low. "I'll have time for sleep later," Arthur replied, waving away the waitress's offer of a menu. "Just coffee, black." For the next hour, Arthur laid out the entire story. He spoke without emotion, his voice flat and precise, like an architect reading a damage report. He detailed the months of quiet gaslighting, the campaign of isolation, the pressure to sell the house, and the final, brutal act of the car's sale. He told David everything, concluding with the fact that his entire secret legacy, the bonds, the deed, Eleanor's last letter was inside that car, now lost to the world. David listened without interruption, his hands clasped around his own coffee cup. When Arthur finished, David was silent for a long moment, his gaze fixed on his old friend. "In all my years as a lawyer," he said finally, his voice tight with fury, "I have handled cases of fraud, theft, and elaborate deception. But I have never seen a betrayal so personal, so cruel." He opened the folder on the table. "You were right to call me. This isn't just about recovering property, Arthur. This is about restoring your honor. We will burn them to the ground." The first step was to assemble their own discreet team. "We need an investigator," David stated. "Not some ex-cop who runs license plates. We need a ghost. Someone who can move without leaving ripples." He already had a man in mind. His name is Michael Corrigan, ex-Army intelligence. He specializes in finding things and people that have been intentionally lost. He's expensive, he's eccentric, but he is the best. He will operate on a cash-only basis and will report only to me. Arthur reached into his coat and slid the thick envelope of emergency cash across the table. "Hire him. I want him starting yesterday." They spent the next 30 minutes defining the mission, a two-pronged attack that would be executed in parallel. "Objective Alpha," David said, writing on a notepad. "Locate the 1968 Ford Mustang. We need to know who the buyer is, where the car is, and what its current condition is. Corrigan is to observe only. Under no circumstances is he to make contact with the new owner. The element of surprise is our most valuable weapon." Arthur nodded in agreement. "And Objective Bravo," he added, his voice hardening. "I want a complete financial autopsy of my son and his wife, going back 3 years. I want to know every credit card they have, every loan they've taken, every dollar they've spent from my accounts. I want to see the receipts for their vacations, their designer clothes, their $500 dinners. I want a portfolio of their greed." David assured him it would be done. Corrigan would handle the unorthodox intelligence gathering, while David himself would begin the process of legally subpoenaing financial records, using a plausible pretext that would keep Ethan and Sarah from becoming suspicious. The trap was being designed. Arthur returned home just as Sarah was coming downstairs, yawning and stretching in her silk pajamas. "Arthur, you're up early," she said, feigning surprise. "Couldn't sleep," he mumbled, shuffling past her towards his armchair, resuming his role as the broken old man. Old bones. He spent the rest of the day in a masterful performance of decline. He stared into space for long periods, answered questions with confused, disjointed phrases, and appeared to have lost all interest in his own life. His act was so convincing that it emboldened Ethan and Sarah to press their final advantage. That evening, they approached him, their faces a mask of compassion. It was Ethan who spoke, his voice soft and patronizing. "Dad, Sarah and I have been talking. After this business with the car, we're worried about you. We think it might be time for us to take the burden of managing your affairs off your shoulders." Officially, Sarah produced a document from a folder, a full power of attorney agreement. "It just makes sense, Arthur," she said, her voice smooth as honey. "It would allow us to handle all the bills, the investments, everything, so you can just relax. You wouldn't have to worry about a thing." This was the moment, the culmination of their campaign. They expected a fight, or at the very least, a flicker of the old, stubborn Arthur. Instead, he looked at the document, then at their expectant faces, and gave a long, theatrical sigh of resignation. He slumped further into his chair, the picture of a man utterly defeated. "Maybe you're right," he whispered, his voice raspy. "It's all become so complicated. I'm so tired of fighting." A current of triumph passed between them, so palpable he could almost feel it in the air. They had him. They had finally, completely won. I'll think about it," Arthur said, waving a dismissive hand. "We can talk to the lawyer next week." "Of course, Dad," Ethan said, barely concealing the grin in his voice. "Take your time." They walked away, confident that the final piece of the puzzle was about to fall into place. They were so blinded by their victory, so sure of his surrender, that they never once thought to ask which lawyer he was planning to see. The bait was in the water, and the sharks were circling, completely unaware of the hook hidden within. While Arthur played the part of a ghost in his own home, a real ghost was at work on his behalf. Michael Corrigan was a name on a payroll, but not a man one would ever meet. He existed in the digital ether, a phantom who moved through databases and online records with silent, surgical precision. His reports arrived not as emails, but as encrypted files uploaded to a secure server that only David Chen could access. Each night, after Ethan and Sarah had gone to bed, Arthur would receive his briefing from David via the burner phone, his study becoming a clandestine command center in the heart of enemy territory. Corrigan's first task was to find the Mustang. He wasted no time on the lie Ethan had told. A man like Corrigan knew that a classic car, even in poor condition, is never sold for scrap. That was a story for fools. He began where the truth was most likely to live, in the quiet, interconnected world of car enthusiasts. He scanned online forums, private social media groups, and the digital footprints of known classic car brokers in the tri-state area. He ran a search through the DMV database, using a contact who owed him a favor, looking for recent title transfers on 1,968 Ford Mustangs. It took him 72 hours. On the third night, David's voice over the phone was grim. "Corrigan found it. Arthur." Arthur's hand tightened on the receiver. "Where?" "It's not in a scrapyard," David said, his voice laced with contempt. "It's in a private restoration workshop in upstate New York. Ethan filed a transfer of title a week before he even told you it was gone. He sold it, Arthur. He sold it for $20,000. Arthur closed his eyes. The number was a physical blow. Not a few $100s for scrap, but a significant sum of money. The lie was so much worse than the truth he had imagined. The $20,000 was a precise calculation of his son's contempt. It was a price high enough to be useful to Ethan, but insultingly low for a car of such sentimental and historical value. It was the monetary value Ethan had placed on his father's heart. "The funds," David continued, his voice like ice, "were deposited into a joint checking account belonging to Ethan and Sarah. An account you are not a signatory on. The money has already been spent. 10,000 of it went to pay down a credit card balance. The other 10 was withdrawn in cash over the course of 3 days. The cold, hard facts confirmed everything. This was not an act of carelessness. It was a premeditated, financially motivated crime, shrouded in the most casual and cruel of lies. Any lingering shred of paternal sentiment in Arthur's heart turned to dust and blew away. He was no longer dealing with a misguided son. He was dealing with an adversary. The next report from Corrigan came 2 days later, and it was a masterpiece of financial forensics. The first part was a dossier on the car's new owner. Her name was Clara Jensen, 32 years old, owner and sole proprietor of CJ Restorations, the workshop where the car was now located. She had a small but stellar reputation online for her meticulous work on American muscle cars from the 60s. She was not a wealthy collector who would flip the car for profit. She was a craftswoman, an artist. This detail was a strange, unexpected variable in Arthur's careful calculations. The second part of the report was the financial autopsy of Ethan and Sarah, and it was brutal. It was a portrait of a lifestyle built on a foundation of debt and deception. Corrigan had compiled a timeline of their spending over the past year, cross-referencing it with the statements from Arthur's own accounts, which they managed. The picture it painted was one of quiet, systematic theft. There was the $8,000 charge for a couple's retreat at a luxury resort in the Caribbean, categorized as a medical expense in Arthur's ledger. There were thousands of dollars in charges at high-end boutiques and restaurants in New York City, all paid for with a credit card whose bill was sent to a P.O. box they had opened without his knowledge. Their own finances were a disaster. They were $93,000 in high-interest consumer debt, spread across a dozen credit cards. They were 2 months behind on the payments for their 2 luxury SUVs. They had taken out a second mortgage on a condo they owned and rented out, and were already defaulting on that. Their primary checking account, the one their salaries went into, had a balance of less than $500. They weren't just living beyond their means, they were in a financial death spiral. "It all makes sense now," Arthur said to David over the phone, the pieces clicking into place. "The pressure to sell the house wasn't about my well-being. It was a desperate attempt to get a massive infusion of cash to save themselves from bankruptcy. They see my home as their personal bailout fund. The $20,000 from the Mustang," he realized, was nothing more than a temporary patch on a hemorrhaging wound. It was just enough to keep their creditors at bay for another month or two, while they worked on their real target, him. His son hadn't just sold his memories for a pittance, he had done it to finance a lie, to maintain an illusion of success that was crumbling around him. The cruelty was matched only by the sheer, pathetic desperation of it all. With the facts in hand, the next step was clear. They had to get to the car. They had to retrieve the contents of the secret compartment before Clara Jensen began her restoration and accidentally discovered it herself. "I have to go see it," Arthur told David. "I have to meet her." They devised a plan, a cover story that was simple and believable. David would call CJ Restorations, representing a client, a retired engineer named Mr. Black, who was a lifelong Mustang enthusiast. Mr. Black, he would explain, had heard through the grapevine about her recent acquisition and, as he was in the area, would be deeply grateful for the opportunity to simply look at the car and reminisce. It was a story that played perfectly on Arthur's age and genuine passion, a cover so close to the truth that it would be effortless to maintain. David made the call. Clara Jensen, perhaps intrigued by the request from an old enthusiast, agreed. The appointment was set for the following Tuesday. For the first time in months, Arthur felt a flicker of something other than grief or anger. It was anticipation. He was no longer just a victim reacting to a crime. He was an actor, about to step onto a stage of his own choosing. The hunt for the past was over. The quest to reclaim his future was about to begin. The journey to upstate New York was a pilgrimage into the unknown. Arthur traveled under his assumed name, Mr. Black, on a train that rattled through a landscape ablaze with autumn colors. He felt a profound sense of dislocation, a man in his own life's third act who had suddenly become a spy. He was met at the small town station by a pre-booked taxi, which took him to a winding country road and deposited him in front of a large, refurbished barn. A simple, elegant wooden sign hung over the wide doors. CJ Restorations. The place was not what he expected. There was no chaotic mess of spare parts or the clang of loud machinery. The air smelled of clean oil, wax, and old leather. It was less a garage and more a museum workshop, a sanctuary where steel and chrome were treated with reverence. Sunlight streamed through large, clean windows, illuminating the forms of several classic cars in various states of revival. And there, in the center of the main bay, as if on a stage, was his Mustang. His heart seized. It was like seeing a ghost, a beloved face he thought he'd lost forever. It was dirtier than he kept it, and it looked somehow smaller, more vulnerable under the high ceilings of this unfamiliar place, but it was unmistakably his. He had to steady himself against a workbench, his carefully constructed composure threatening to shatter. A figure emerged from behind the car, wiping her hands on a clean rag. It was a young woman with her hair tied back in a practical ponytail, her eyes sharp and intelligent. "Mr. Black?" she asked, her voice clear and confident. "I'm Clara Jensen." Her handshake was firm, her grip strong and capable. Arthur cleared his throat, forcing himself to stay in character. "Miss Jensen, thank you for seeing me. She's a beautiful machine." Clara smiled, a genuine, warm smile that reached her eyes. She's something special, a real survivor. You said on the phone you were an enthusiast? Arthur nodded, walking slowly toward the car, running a hand gently along its fender. My first car was a '67 coupe. Very similar. I've regretted selling it my whole life. He was weaving a fiction from the threads of his own truth. He began to point out small details, the things a casual observer would never notice. The chrome on the '68 grille is unique, he said, more to himself than to her. And this paint, the moss green, it was a one-year-only color. Most people don't know that. He peered inside. The radio still has the original push buttons. Amazing they haven't been replaced. Clara watched him, her head tilted with growing curiosity. This was not the idle chatter of a typical car show enthusiast. This was the intimate language of an owner. His hands moved over the car with a familiarity that was almost tender. "What made you buy this one in particular?" Arthur asked, his gaze still fixed on the dashboard. "It must have been a private sale. I didn't see it listed on any of the major sites." Clara leaned against her workbench, crossing her arms. "It was a strange situation. A man called me, said his father had passed away, and he needed to clear out the garage quickly. He sent a few blurry pictures. He didn't seem to know much about it, and his asking price was ridiculously low. I almost thought it was a scam. My son," Arthur thought, a fresh wave of cold anger washing over him. He had not only sold the car, he had erased Arthur from the story, claiming he was dead. "But something about it felt right," Clara continued, her expression softening. "This car, it's more than just a project for me. It's a piece of history, a legend in my family, you could say." Arthur turned from the car, his interest piqued. "A legend?" Clara gestured for him to sit on a nearby stool, and she began to tell a story. "My grandfather was a man named George Jensen. He was an engineer. Built a small manufacturing firm from the ground up right after the war with his best friend, his business partner. They were like brothers. My grandfather was the quiet genius, and his partner was the visionary, the architect of their success." Arthur felt a strange prickling on his skin. He stopped breathing. George Jensen, his partner, his best friend, who had been taken by cancer 30 years ago. "My grandfather always said this partner was the most honorable man he ever knew," Clara went on, lost in the memory of the story. "When my father was a boy, he got terribly sick. The medical bills were astronomical, enough to bankrupt the family and the young company. But my grandfather's partner stepped in. He paid for everything out of his own pocket, no questions asked, no loan papers signed. He saved my father's life and our family. He told my grandfather that loyalty was the only currency that mattered." Arthur felt the floor shift beneath his feet. He remembered that time. He remembered George's panic and the relief on his face. It was something he had done without a second thought. It was what friends did. "My grandfather never forgot that," Clara said, her voice thick with emotion, "and he always talked about his partner's car. The moss green '68 Mustang he bought on his honeymoon. He said it was a symbol of the man himself, honest, powerful, and built to last. He had old black and white photos of it. A few weeks ago, when that man sent me the pictures of this car for sale, I froze. I just knew, it was the same one. I didn't care what condition it was in. I had to buy it. It felt like, I don't know, like I was preserving a piece of my grandfather's soul." She finally looked at Arthur, at the tears streaming silently down his old face. Her own eyes widened in confusion. "Mr. Black, are you all right?" He took a shaky breath, the name he had given himself now feeling like a cheap disguise. The universe had just presented him with a miracle, a karmic echo from a half-forgotten act of kindness. He could not, would not, maintain the lie. "Clara," he said, his voice trembling as he stood up. "Your grandfather, George. He was my best friend, my partner." He looked her straight in the eye, the truth now laid bare between them. "My name is not Black. My name is Arthur Pendleton." The color drained from Clara's face. She stared at him, her mind racing to connect the dots. The stories, the car, the man standing before her. Pendleton? She whispered. The name spoken with the reverence of a myth. You're him? He could only nod, his heart too full for words. In an instant, she understood. Oh my God, she breathed, her hand flying to her mouth. The man who sold it to me? He said his father. That means, he is my son. Arthur finished for him, the words tasting like ash. Clara's shock turned to a fierce, protective anger on his behalf. Then, without hesitation, she grabbed a set of keys from a hook on the wall and thrust them into his hand. The car is yours, she said, her voice unwavering. It was always yours. The money. I'll write you a check right now. This is wrong. All of this is wrong. Arthur looked at the keys in his palm, then back at her earnest, loyal face, a face so much like her grandfather's. He gently closed her hand over the keys and pushed them back toward her. Clara, he said, his voice now steady, filled with a newfound strength. This car is in better hands now than it has been in a very long time. Your hands. But there is something inside it, a legacy, something my wife and I built, hidden away from the world. Something my son knows nothing about. He leaned in closer, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. I cannot retrieve it alone. I came here today looking for a car, but I think I found something far more important. He paused, looking into her eyes. I found an ally. Clara's response was immediate. A slow, determined smile spread across her face. Mr. Pendleton, she said, for my grandfather? And for you? Tell me what we do next. With their alliance forged on the shared history of their grandfathers, the atmosphere in the workshop shifted. The air of emotional reunion gave way to the quiet, focused tension of a secret operation. We can't do this out in the open, Clara said, her voice now that of a calm, capable field commander. She walked over to the large barn doors and slid the heavy bolt across, the sound echoing in the cavernous space. She lowered the shades on the windows, plunging the workshop into a world of their own, illuminated only by the bright, clean light of the overhead fixtures. On the front door, she hung a sign, closed for private restoration. She had created a sanctuary, a safe house where Arthur's past could be carefully resurrected. Arthur, in turn, described the mechanism for the secret compartment, not as a man recalling a vague memory, but as an architect dictating the specifications of a hidden vault. It was designed to seem like an electrical fault if you got the sequence wrong, he explained. There's no physical keyhole to find. The car's own electrical system is the key. Clara nodded, understanding immediately. She wheeled over a heavy-duty battery charger and clipped the leads to the Mustang's terminals, bringing the dormant machine back to life. The dashboard lights flickered on with a faint, ghostly glow. It's ready, she said, her voice a low whisper. Arthur approached the driver's side door, his hand hesitating for a moment before he opened it. Sliding into the driver's seat was like stepping back in time. The worn leather molded to his form, a perfect impression of his own body left over decades. He breathed in deeply. The air inside was thick with the scent of old vinyl, engine oil, and the faint, almost imperceptible ghost of Eleanor's perfume. For a moment, he closed his eyes, allowing himself to feel her presence beside him, a silent partner in this strange and necessary mission. Then he began the sequence. He turned the key in the ignition, stopping just short of starting the engine, bringing the car to the accessory position. The radio hummed softly. He reached for the headlight knob, his fingers finding the familiar groove. He pulled it out once, twice, a soft click each time. Then, his foot moved to the brake pedal. He pressed it 3 times, not hard, but with a deliberate, rhythmic pressure. 1, 2, 3. For a second, nothing happened. Then, from beneath the chassis, came a soft, low thump. It was not a loud noise, but in the dead silence of the workshop, it sounded like a heartbeat. That's it, Arthur breathed. Clara gave him a sharp, affirmative nod and moved to the controls of the hydraulic lift. With a low hum, the powerful arms of the lift raised the Mustang a foot off the ground, then 2, then 6, until its undercarriage was perfectly exposed in the bright light. Clara moved underneath, her eyes scanning the frame. "My God, Arthur," she said, her voice filled with professional admiration. "This is a work of art. I would never have found this in a million years." A small panel, no bigger than a book, had dropped down by less than half an inch, perfectly flush with the surrounding metal. She used a small, specialized tool to gently pry it open, revealing not a hollow space, but the top of a gleaming, watertight, fireproof steel box. It was fitted into the frame with masterful precision. At Arthur's direction, she carefully unbolted the box from its housing and slid it out. It was heavy, dense with the weight of his entire secret life. They carried it together to a clean, metal workbench, an altar for this strange ceremony. Arthur produced a small, flat key from a hidden pocket in his wallet and unlocked the box. As he lifted the lid, the contents were revealed, lying on a bed of dark velvet. The stacks of bearer bonds, bundled neatly with paper bands. The folded, crisp pages of the deed to the cabin in Maine. And resting on top of it all, the cream-colored envelope that made Arthur's heart ache. He reached in and lifted the letter, holding it as if it were the most fragile object on earth. The relief was so profound, so overwhelming, that he had to brace himself on the workbench. He had it back. He was whole again. He looked at Clara, who was watching him, with a respectful, quiet intensity. In her, he saw not only the ghost of his friend George, but a spirit of integrity that he had feared was extinct. He made a decision, a gesture of absolute trust. "Eleanor was a very wise woman," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "She saw the true character of people, the things they tried to hide. I think she would have liked you very much, Clara." He carefully broke the wax seal on the envelope and unfolded the letter within, the paper crinkling softly. He scanned the familiar, elegant script until he found the passage he was looking for. He cleared his throat and read aloud. "My dearest Arthur," he began, "our love has always been our fortress, but a wise builder knows you must also have a lifeboat. I have watched our Ethan grow into a man, and while I pray he has a good heart, I see how it is so easily swayed by the world's shiny, empty things. I fear he has learned the price of everything, but the value of nothing. Should you ever find yourself caught in a storm of his making, I want you to use this lifeboat we have built together. Do not use it to sail back to the way things were. Use it to find a new shore, a safe harbor where our true legacy, kindness, loyalty, and a life built on love. Not things can flourish once more." He stopped reading, his eyes wet with tears. The letter was not just a comfort, it was a prophecy and a permission slip, a guide from beyond the grave. Clara was speechless, her own eyes glistening. She now understood the full weight of what they were doing. This was not just about money or a car. This was a rescue mission for a man's soul, for a legacy of love that was in danger of being extinguished by greed. Arthur carefully folded the letter and placed it back in the box. He then looked around the workshop, at the tools, at the projects, at the clear evidence of her skill and passion. "Your grandfather was a brilliant engineer," he said, his voice now clear and strong, "and I see his spirit in you. But talent needs resources to grow, to truly flourish." He gestured to the box. "This is my lifeboat, Clara, and I believe I have just found my safe harbor." He made his offer then and there. He would provide her with the capital to expand her business, to buy the state-of-the-art equipment she needed, to hire an apprentice, to turn her passion into a legacy of her own. "Consider it an investment," he said, "from one family friend to another. No strings, no expectations, only my complete faith in you." Clara looked from Arthur's earnest face to the steel box and then back again. She was not accepting a handout, she was accepting a mantle, a continuation of the bond that had started generations ago. "I would be honored, Arthur," she said, her voice firm. "We'll build something that lasts, something both our grandfathers would be proud of." They shook on it, their hands clasping over the unlocked legacy. The mission had changed. It was no longer just about revenge. It was about redemption. It was about building a new future on the foundations of a loyal past. The drive back from Clara's workshop was a study in contrasts. Outside the taxi window, the world was the same, a blur of ordinary life. But inside Arthur, A fundamental shift had occurred. The steel box containing his legacy rested safely in a nondescript duffel bag on the seat beside him, a tangible weight that grounded him. He was no longer a victim adrift. He was a man with resources, a plan, and a powerful, unexpected ally. His first stop was not home, but the city, where he met David Chen in a private conference room that David had booked under a corporate pseudonym. On the polished mahogany table between them, Arthur opened the box. For David, a man accustomed to the dry world of contracts and trusts, the sight of the bearer bonds and the handwritten letter was a glimpse into a different era. He handled them with a quiet reverence. The first order of business was to convert a fraction of this analog wealth into digital power. David, through his network, engaged a discreet broker in Switzerland who specialized in such archaic financial instruments. Within 48 hours, $250,000 from the liquidated bonds was wired to a newly established entity, the Eleanor Pendleton Trust. Arthur was the sole trustee. The trust's stated purpose was the preservation of classic arts and craftsmanship, a legal framework that was both a tribute to his wife and a perfect vehicle for his plans. The first official act of the trust was to wire $50,000 to CJ Restorations as an initial capital investment. The transaction was clean, legal, and left a clear paper trail of his new alliance. The next step was to return to the lion's den. He arrived home in the late afternoon, looking intentionally disheveled and weary from his trip to visit an old college friend. The duffel bag was gone, its precious contents now stored in a secure vault managed by David. He walked through his front door and was immediately met by the cloying concern of his daughter-in-law. "Arthur, there you are. We were starting to get worried. Did you have a nice time?" Sarah asked, her eyes scanning him for any sign of change. "It was fine," Arthur mumbled, allowing a tremor of exhaustion into his voice. "Just tired. So very tired." He spent the next few days deepening his performance. He was more forgetful, more distant than ever. He would leave sentences unfinished and stare out the window for hours. He was building their confidence, lulling them into a state of absolute certainty that his will had been completely eroded. He was letting them believe they had already won. The moment to spring the trap came on a Thursday evening, over a dinner of flavorless chicken that Sarah had prepared. The three of them were eating in near silence when Arthur let out a long, theatrical sigh that seemed to carry the weight of a lifetime of regret. Ethan and Sarah both looked up, their interest piqued. "Is something wrong, Dad?" Ethan asked, his tone laced with the patronizing patience of a man dealing with a difficult child. Arthur looked from his son to his daughter-in-law, his expression a carefully crafted mask of sorrow and defeat. "I've been doing a lot of thinking," he began, his voice barely a whisper, "about this house. About all the paperwork, the responsibilities." He pushed his plate away, as if he had lost his appetite. "You're right. You were right all along. I'm too old for this fight. It's a burden, and I'm ready to lay it down." He let the words hang in the air, watching as a poorly concealed light of triumph flickered in their eyes. He saw them exchange a microscopic glance, a spark of pure, unadulterated greed passing between them. "I'll do it," Arthur said, delivering the killing blow to their last remaining doubt. "I'll sign the power of attorney. And we can call the realtor. We can sell the house. It's time." The effect was instantaneous. Sarah's face broke into a radiant, beatific smile. "Oh, Arthur," she breathed, reaching across the table to pat his hand. "I am so glad to hear you say that. We are so proud of you for making this decision. It's for the best, you'll see. You'll be so much happier without all this stress." Ethan, ever the pragmatist, immediately shifted to logistics. "That's great, Dad. Really great. I can have our lawyer draw up the final papers and bring them over tomorrow. We can get it all signed and done right here at the kitchen table. No need to make a big fuss." But this was where Arthur seized control, all while appearing to cede it completely. He shook his head, a look of mournful dignity on his face. "No," he said quietly but firmly. "Not here. Not like this." They looked at him, confused. "If I am going to sign away the home your mother and I built, the company I founded, the very foundations of my life. I will not do it over a plate of cold chicken." He straightened himself in his chair, summoning a flicker of his old architectural authority. "We will do this the right way, the honorable way. We will have a formal meeting at the offices of my lawyer, David Chen. We will have it all reviewed and signed there, with proper witnesses. It is the last significant act of my independent life, and it will be treated with the respect it deserves." His insistence on using his own lawyer might have been a warning bell, but his reasoning was a stroke of genius. He had framed it not as a legal maneuver, but as an old man's sentimental request for dignity, a final, harmless eccentricity. Ethan and Sarah, now just one signature away from the fortune they craved, were in no mood to argue over the venue. They saw it as a meaningless concession. Their own lawyer could review the documents beforehand. The outcome was already assured. They would humor the old man's desire for a little ceremony. "Of course, Dad," Ethan said smoothly, already tasting victory. "Whatever you want, we'll call Mr. Chen's office in the morning and set it up." The appointment was made for the following Wednesday at 10 a.m. Ethan and Sarah marked the date on their calendars, circling it in red, seeing it as the glorious dawn of their new, unburdened life. They never for a moment suspected that they were not scheduling a signing. They were scheduling an execution. The day of the meeting arrived, a crisp, bright Wednesday that felt to Ethan and Sarah like a coronation. They chose their attire with the care of people preparing for a victory photograph. Ethan wore an expensive Italian suit, a little too flashy for a simple legal meeting, and Sarah was dressed in a chic designer dress, a statement of the wealth she was about to officially possess. As they drove into the city, their conversation was a giddy blueprint for their future. They spoke of selling the house, of the European cruise they would take, of the new, larger SUV they would buy. They were victors dividing the spoils of a war they believed they had already won. Their only annoyance was the venue. David Chen's law firm was in a prestigious downtown skyscraper, a world of hushed tones, thick carpets, and old money. It felt stuffy and overly formal to them, but they endured it as the final, theatrical whim of a defeated old man. They announced themselves to the receptionist and were shown to a large conference room on the 40th floor. The room was intimidating. A single, colossal slab of polished mahogany served as the table, surrounded by high-backed leather chairs. One entire wall was a sheet of glass, offering a panoramic, godlike view of the city below. David Chen was already there, standing by the window. He greeted them with a cool, unreadable professionalism that set them slightly on edge. They took seats on one side of the vast table, feeling strangely small and out of place. The conference room door opened, and Arthur Pendleton walked in. The effect was so jarring, so utterly contrary to their expectations, that for a moment, both Ethan and Sarah simply stared, their minds unable to process what they were seeing. The man who entered the room was not the frail, shuffling figure in a worn cardigan they had left at home that morning. This was a different man entirely. Arthur was dressed in a perfectly tailored charcoal suit that spoke of quiet authority. A crisp, white shirt and a simple, elegant silk tie completed the ensemble. His silver hair was neatly combed, his jaw was set, and his shoes were polished to a mirror shine. He wasn't stooped. His posture was as straight and true as the buildings he used to design. He walked with a silent, steady confidence, and his eyes, when they met his son's, were not cloudy with confusion, but were as clear, sharp, and cold as a winter sky. He looked, in that moment, exactly like what he was. A titan of his industry, a man who had commanded boardrooms and built empires. He looked like their father, the man they had long ago forgotten. And he was not alone. Walking in just behind him was the young woman they had seen him with at the house a few times, the one he had vaguely introduced as a friend. Clara Jensen was dressed in a professional, dark blue pantsuit, her expression calm and serious. Arthur took his place at the head of the table, the seat of ultimate power. Clara sat to his right, and David to his left. They were a united front, a tribunal. Ethan and Sarah were no longer participants in a signing. They were the accused in a courtroom. "What is this?" Ethan stammered, gesturing toward Clara. "Who is she? What's going on?" Arthur placed his hands flat on the table, a gesture of absolute control. "This," he said, his voice a low, resonant baritone they hadn't heard in years, "is my business advisor and trusted associate, Miss Clara Jensen. She has been instrumental in the restructuring of my estate." The words restructuring and estate hung in the air, alien and alarming. Ethan, trying to wrestle back control of a situation that was rapidly slipping away, forced a laugh. "All right, Dad, a little bit of drama. I get it. Can we just sign the paperwork so we can all get on with our day?" David Chen did not produce the thin sheaf of papers they were expecting. Instead, he placed two thick, spiral-bound documents on the table and slid them across the polished surface. They landed in front of Ethan and Sarah with a heavy, final thud. The covers were blank. Confused, Ethan opened his. His eyes widened. It was not a legal contract. The first page was a high-resolution copy of a credit card statement with his and Sarah's names on it. He flipped the page, and another, and another. It was all there, a meticulously compiled history of their secret life. Sarah opened hers and let out a small, choked gasp. Arthur watched them, his face an unreadable mask of granite. Then he began to speak, his voice calm, even, and utterly devastating. "Let's start with page 5, shall we?" he said, as if beginning a corporate presentation. "An $8,000 charge from the Four Seasons in Anguilla, dated this past February. As I recall, that was the week you told me you were attending a financial planning seminar in a much less glamorous city. I do hope you enjoyed the spa. I see you charged it to my household account, categorizing it under home maintenance." He continued, his voice never rising, as he narrated their betrayal back to them, page by page. He detailed the shopping sprees in Soho, the lavish dinners, the weekends away, all of it stolen, all of it documented. He pointed out the systematic way they had funneled his money into their own accounts, the lies they had told, the pathetic, grasping nature of their greed. Ethan's face went from confused to red with anger, to a pale, sickly white. Sarah began to cry silently, her carefully applied makeup starting to run. Finally, Arthur directed them to the last page of the dossier. "And this," he said, his voice dropping, now laced with a fine, sharp edge of steel, "this is the masterpiece." It was a copy of the official bill of sale for the 1968 Ford Mustang, clearly showing the buyer, Clara Jensen, and the sale price, $20,000. "You told me you sold it for scrap," Arthur said, his eyes locking onto his son's. "You stood in my garage and told me you got a few $100s for the last, most precious memory I had of your mother. You let me believe it was crushed into a cube of meaningless metal. But you didn't. You sold it for a profit, a pathetic little profit to patch the holes in your sinking financial ship. The lie, Ethan. The casual, cruel, unnecessary lie. That is the part I will never forgive." He leaned forward slightly, the full weight of his presence pressing down on them. "So, no," he said, his voice dropping to a near whisper. "We will not be signing a power of attorney today. You see, I have been under the impression that my mind was failing me. But it turns out, my memory is perfectly clear. I know everything." The silence that fell over the conference room was absolute, heavier than the mahogany table, deeper than the city canyons visible through the window. Ethan and Sarah sat frozen, the thick dossiers of their deceit lying open before them like funeral wreaths. The truth, in all its ugly, documented detail, had smothered the air in the room, leaving no space for lies or denial. Ethan was the first to break, not with remorse, but with a final, sputtering burst of indignant rage. "This is insane," he spat, his face a blotchy patchwork of red and white. "You can't do this. He's an old man. He's confused. You," he jabbed a trembling finger at David, "you're manipulating him. And you?" he wheeled on Clara, his eyes wild with bewildered fury. "Who the hell are you to be involved in my family's affairs?" Arthur didn't flinch. He simply watched his son's pathetic eruption, his expression unchanging. He let the accusations echo and die in the soundproofed room until only the frantic thumping of Ethan's own heart was audible. When the silence returned, Arthur gave a small, almost imperceptible nod to his lawyer. David Chen adjusted his glasses and spoke, his voice the calm, dispassionate instrument of the law. "If you are quite finished, Mr. Pendleton," he said to Ethan, affording him a title that now seemed utterly alien. "We have a few final documents to review." He reached into his briefcase and produced a slim, leather-bound portfolio. The papers he slid across the table this time were not copies, they were originals, bearing fresh signatures and the embossed seal of a notary. "First," David began, "is a formal declaration. By its authority, Mr. Arthur Pendleton legally and irrevocably severs all familiar ties with you, Ethan Pendleton. While the law may recognize a biological connection, your father no longer does. You are, for all legal and personal intents and purposes, disinherited." Ethan stared at the paper, the word disinherited hanging in the air, like a guillotine's blade. Sarah let out a sound like a wounded animal. But Arthur wasn't finished. He spoke himself now, his voice resonating with a lifetime of suppressed disappointment. "A son is meant to be a legacy, Ethan, a continuation of a family's honor. You have proven to be nothing more than a liability. Therefore, I am cutting my losses." David let the weight of that statement settle before continuing. "Second," he said, pushing another document forward, "is your father's new last will and testament, signed and witnessed this past Monday. It revokes all previous versions. According to this new will, the entirety of the Pendleton estate, upon your father's passing, is to be transferred to a charitable organization." He paused for effect. "The Eleanor Pendleton Foundation for Arts and Craftsmanship. Its mission will be to support young artists, mechanics, and designers who, unlike some, appreciate the value of creating things that last." He gestured toward Clara. "Miss Jensen has graciously agreed to serve as a founding member on the board of directors." The cruelty of the gesture was exquisite. He had not only replaced his son in his will, he had replaced him with the very person who now possessed his mother's car. "As for the house you currently reside in," David added, his tone becoming even colder, "it is no longer considered a private residence. It is now the primary asset of the aforementioned foundation. You will receive a formal notice of eviction within the week. You have 90 days to vacate the premises." The reality of their situation was now crashing down on them. Homelessness, pennilessness. The dream of inheritance had evaporated, replaced by the terrifying certainty of ruin. But Arthur had saved his masterstroke for last. "You see," Arthur said, a hint of a lecture in his tone, as if speaking to a particularly slow student, "your vision has always been limited. You were so focused on the things you could see, the house, the stock portfolio, that you never bothered to consider what you couldn't see." He gestured vaguely, as if to a world they would never know. "Eleanor and I made preparations for a future that was always meant to be ours alone. That legacy, my true wealth, is secure. It is beyond your reach, and you will never see a single penny of it." With a final, precise movement, David Chen slid one last piece of paper across the table. It was not a will or a trust, it was a formal demand letter. And finally, David said, "There is the matter of reimbursement. This is a bill for $172,450. It is the sum that our forensic accountants have determined you have systematically misappropriated from your father's accounts over the past 3 years. We have, as you know, comprehensive documentation to support our claim. We expect payment arrangements to be made within 30 days. If not, we will proceed with a civil suit for fraud and financial elder abuse. I assure you, we will win." That was the breaking point. The fantasy of receiving millions had been replaced by the nightmare of owing a fortune. The transformation in them was total. The arrogance, the defiance, it all dissolved into a primal, pathetic panic. "Dad, Dad, please," Sarah wailed, her voice cracking, the tears now flowing freely. "We're sorry. We made a mistake. A terrible mistake." Ethan, his face ashen and slick with sweat, lunged forward, his hands flat on the table. "You can't do this. Please, Dad, I'm your son. We're your family. Don't do this to us." They were pleading, groveling, their expensive clothes looking like cheap costumes on two people who had just lost everything. Arthur listened to their pleas, his expression unchanging. He had waited months to hear these words, and now that they had come, he felt nothing. no satisfaction, no pity. Only a vast, quiet emptiness. He slowly pushed his chair back and rose to his full height, a towering figure of judgment. He looked down at the two broken people who had been his family and delivered his final verdict. "You place the value of my life's greatest love at $20,000, he said, his voice quiet, almost a whisper. "The cost of your lesson in its true value is everything you have left." He turned then, without another word, and walked toward the door. Clara stood and followed him. He didn't look back. David Chen gathered his papers into his briefcase. "My assistant will show you out," he said to the weeping figures at the table, before turning to follow Arthur, leaving Ethan and Sarah utterly alone in the opulent room, surrounded by the wreckage of their lives, with a God's eye view of a city that no longer belonged to them. Justice is not always a thunderous explosion. Sometimes it is the quiet, inevitable process of collapse that follows when a rotten foundation is exposed. For Ethan and Sarah, the aftermath was a slow, agonizing slide into the very life they had so desperately tried to outrun. The 90-day eviction notice was the first blow. The life of curated perfection they had built within the walls of Arthur's home was dismantled box by box, the movers carting away the symbols of their stolen status. The lawsuit Arthur had filed was a bloodletting, forcing them into a humiliating bankruptcy. They sold their luxury cars, their designer clothes, their hollow trinkets, all of it consumed by the mountain of debt they had created. Their new home was a cramped, two-bedroom apartment in a dreary complex by the highway, where the walls were thin and the air smelled of disappointment. The silence between them, once a comfortable space for shared conspiracy, became a suffocating void of blame and resentment. Their partnership, forged in the shallow fires of greed, could not survive the cold reality of having nothing. They were left with only the bitter ashes of their choices, a life sentence to be served together in a prison of their own making. Arthur never spoke to them again. He never had to. While their world shrank, Arthur's was expanding in ways he had never imagined. 6 months after that day in the conference room, the first green shoots of spring were pushing through the soil in the woods of Maine. Here, beside a tranquil, glass-like lake, stood the cabin that he and Eleanor had built, their secret sanctuary. For months, he and Clara had worked to bring it back to life. They had sanded the old floors, replaced the weathered porch steps, and put a new coat of paint on the shutters. The cabin, once a dusty and forgotten relic, was now filled with light, warmth, and the smell of cedar and wood smoke. It was a resurrection, both for the house and for the man who loved it. Here, Arthur found a new purpose. The Eleanor Pendleton Foundation was not just a legal entity, it was the active continuation of his wife's spirit. He and Clara would spend their afternoons reviewing applications from young, struggling artists and craftspeople, a furniture maker with brilliant designs but no tools, a young mechanic with a preternatural gift for engines but no garage of her own. Arthur, the architect, found a new joy, not in designing buildings of steel, but in helping to build the foundations of young lives. His wealth was no longer a secret hoard, but a flowing river, nourishing talent and rewarding integrity. And in the newly built garage next to the cabin, the 1968 Ford Mustang rested in a place of honor. Clara had completed its restoration, and it was perfect. Its moss green paint gleamed, its chrome shone, and its engine hummed with a deep, contented purr. It was no longer a haunted vessel of memory, but a vibrant, living symbol of a future reclaimed from the ashes of betrayal. One evening, as the setting sun painted the lake in hues of orange and purple, Arthur and Clara sat on the porch, a comfortable silence between them. He held the familiar cream-colored envelope in his hands, its wax seal long broken. "There's one last part of this," he said quietly, looking at Clara, the woman who had become the daughter he never had. "The part I've never read aloud to anyone. I think, after all this, Eleanor would want you to hear it." He unfolded the letter, his eyes finding the final paragraph. His voice was steady as he read her last words into the twilight. "And so, my dearest Arthur," he read, "if the worst should come to pass, and our son's compass proves broken, I want you to remember this. Our true legacy is not in our bank accounts, nor even in the walls of the house we loved. It is a seed. It is the kindness we showed George Jensen. It is the quiet integrity we tried to live by. If that seed cannot grow in the soil we provided for it, do not let it die. I am giving you my final instruction, my love. Find better ground. Find a worthy soul, someone who understands that a life's value is measured in the loyalty of its friendships and the beauty of its sunsets. Give them the seed to plant. In that way, Arthur, our love, our life, our story, it will never truly end. He finished reading and carefully folded the letter. The final piece of the puzzle had slotted into place. His quest had never been about revenge. It had been about fulfilling a sacred duty, about honoring his wife's final prescient wish. He had found better ground. He had found a worthy soul. He looked at Clara, who was smiling through her tears, and then out at the magnificent sunset. He was at peace. Never underestimate the silence of a person who has endured too much, for in that silence, they are not surrendering, they are reloading. Thank you for listening. Join us next time for another story of secrets buried and truths unearthed.